Good evening, everyone. How are you feeling tonight? I know it was a little hot, a little humid on the way over, but not the worst we've had recently here in DC, right? Awesome. Well, welcome to all of you here at Busboys and Poets Books in Washington, D.C. And hello to everyone tuning in virtually. We're so excited to see you. I know you can't see my lovely face, but you are seeing the lovely faces of our guests tonight. And to start ourselves off, I'm going to go ahead and do introductions, and then we'll get into the meat of what exactly is behind Mr. Collins' debut novel. So, joining him today, we have Tope Folarin, a Nigerian-American writer based in Washington, D.C. He serves as the director of the Institute for Policy Studies and is currently the Lannan Visiting Lecturer in Creative Writing at Georgetown. He's the recipient of the Kane Prize for African Writing, the Whiting Award for Fiction, and a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, among others. He was educated at Morehouse College and the University of Oxford, where he earned 2 master's degrees as a Rhodes Scholar. His debut novel, A Particular Kind of Black Man, was published by Simon & Schuster. Joining them as well on the stage is Liz Butler. Perfect. Liz Butler has over 20 years of experience organizing and campaigning on critical issues with a focus on both corporate and legislative campaigns. She currently serves as the Movement Strategy Center's Network Organizing Project Director and Senior Fellow. That was a mouthful. That means it was pretty important. She has extensive experience in campaigning, fundraising, organizing, facilitation, movement building, and a lot more. She lives just outside of Washington, D.C. with her husband and son. And the man of the hour, Chuck Collins, is a campaigner and storyteller who worked for decades on environmental and economic justice campaigns. He's the director of the program on inequality and the common good at the Institute for Policy Studies, where he co-edits inequality.org. He is the co-founder of divestinvest.org, a global movement to divest from fossil fuels and invest in climate solutions, and trustee of the Post-Carbon Institute and resilience.org. He's an expert on U.S. inequality, community resilience, and the racial wealth divide, and the author of numerous reports and several other books, including Is Inequality in America Irreversible? He is a founding board member of the Patriotic Millionaires. He lives with his family in southern Vermont, and Alter to Erupting Sun is his debut novel. Let's go ahead and put our hands together and give our guests a warm welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Really appreciate it. I can't even begin to describe how excited I am to have this conversation. This is exactly the kind of conversation I envisioned having when I started at IPS a couple years ago, a conversation that merges, sort of the importance of storytelling and fiction with activism. So really excited about digging into that conversation today. I guess I just wanted to start with the man of the hour, Chuck. I think a lot of us know you as somebody who writes excellent, incredible nonfiction. You have done that your entire career. I'm wondering why you felt a turn to fiction was necessary. What about, and also what inspired you as you began to write the story? What kind of novels inspired you to write this?
Well, thanks both of you, and thanks all of you for coming out on this hot night. And I bring greetings from the brave little state of Vermont, where we've kind of been suffering, the disrupted future today. For the last couple weeks, and still are digging out big time. But for me, fiction has been a gateway. It's been one of the ways I've gotten inspired. Historical fiction has gotten me interested in history. Fiction about a place has gotten me interested in learning more about a place. I can remember reading Orhan Pamuk about Turkey and think, oh, now I want to learn more about Turkish history, but it was really through fiction. And then when it comes to kind of facing the moment we're in, I'm intrigued by some of the, I guess you could call them the future fiction, speculative fiction, the Ursula Le Guins and the Octavia Butlers and people who weren't just thinking about the end of the world or looking 200 years out, but were kind of offering us some insight into our condition. And and the other just detail is I would hear people talk about bold actions in relation to climate change, and I kind of wanted to play that out in a fictional space, which is easier and more appropriate. So all those things I think came together with just, I wanting to tell stories, thinking about Adam McKay and the Don't Look Up movie as a way that got kind of, and the final thing was somebody just said to me last week, I've read a few of your books, but I've never taken one on a beach vacation before. And I thought, well, that's exactly what we want. We want
Beach
more.
reads, yeah.
We want people to be reading social fiction around
Yeah.
as a driver. So that to me was part of it.
Yeah. No, it's. I hope all of you get a copy of this book. It's really powerful. It's resonant. It's important as well. Liz, I've not had the pleasure of meeting you before this moment, but I've heard a number of great things about you. I was hoping you'd tell us a little bit about, first of all, your life as an activist. How did that start? What sort of inspired you to walk down that path?
I've been an activist since I was a teenager, and like a lot of Gen Xers, there wasn't the level of information that we have now. So many of us who walked into activism had some pivotal moments where we saw an injustice and assumed that you could just fix it, and then having conversations with folks and realizing, no, you couldn't, that it was going to take leaning into a fight. So, everything from when I was like 9 or 10, I was going to pro-choice rallies with my minister, because I grew up in the United Church of Christ, not not the right-wing part of the Christian faith. So, to doing work on some animal rights. I've been a vegan since I was 17. I'm 51, and then my first paid role was working for the Mass Toxics campaign in Boston, fighting over the Boston Harbor. I started as a canvasser, but honestly, I haven't professionally. I've only done organizing and campaigning, which is a total privilege to be in that space. And at the time, it was harder to find information about organizing. It was harder to figure out, who were the folks to look up to. I had met Heather Booth when I was young. I know her now. I don't think she remembers that part, but there was a big Midwest Academy conference that I was able to go to at 20, and that was really powerful. That actually made me make a decision to be an organizer for the rest of my life. I went to a conference, I heard what the fights were and what it was going to take to win, and I walked out of there going, that's what I'm going to do. I'm glad now that that's not what people have to go through to find out how to be part of a fight. That's the one advantage of this moment. There's a lot of challenges of this moment, but the access to information means that people can come together to create collective people power in an easier way than 30 years ago.
I had lunch last week with a student at American University. She reached out to me on LinkedIn, and we had a great lunch. And among other things, she said that she already felt exhausted with her work as an activist. She's all of 21 years old, I guess, and said that the challenges seemed so enormous and so difficult that she was in a place where she felt that she needed to step back in some ways from the work. I wanted to ask you, what has kept you invested in the work and invigorated through all these years that you've been doing it?
A couple of things. One is that I look at all the organizing and campaigning that we do as much about the fight that we're in now as it is about developing the next generation of activists and mentoring people, because the book shows this. Those of us who fight on issues, who actually understand how connected they are, you have to be training other folks to take on the other issues, and we all have to assume that this is the fight's not going to end. It's not going to end in 20 years. It's not going to end in 30 years, even if it shifts an issue basis. So a lot of times what motivates me is how are we developing that longer range. And then I do think that there has been gaps in strategy and folks who are not willing to escalate, and it is something that I feel strongly about and believe in. And so that the fact that that is clear, that we need folks who are willing to train people in direct action, execute direct action, and just be willing to push the envelope in the movement is very motivating to me, because I don't think that piece is oversaturated.
Yeah.
Versus, there's a lot of lobbyists in our movement. I love the
Sure.
lobbyists. They play a very important
Yeah.
role, but we have to have more of the how do we do disruptive escalations on all of the issues that we all fight on.
Yeah, it's part of what this book is about, right, Chuck? About that kind of drive, this sense of urgency that your protagonist has, Rae, around those issues. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how you kind of took on that subject, trying to capture that sense of urgency that many of us feel, especially in this moment of mounting crises across any number of areas. How did you go about doing that as you wrote this?
Well, one hope in this book was to, in a work of fiction, show the life of a person like Liz Butler, who is a lifelong activist who goes through cycles of life
Yeah.
but kind of stays committed. And I don't know that many works of fiction that portray the inner life and the long over their lifetime journey of somebody who's working for environmental, racial, and justice over their life. So yeah, I had one agenda, which was I wanted to try to create an activist characters,
Yeah.
but then, in this moment, and here, it's not a spoiler alert to say that the book starts with this, my main character, Rae Kelliher, is facing down terminal illness.
Mhm.
She decides to take her life and the life of the CEO of a fossil fuel company. So it's a provocative start, but really as Liz said, I think we're heading into a moment where we're going to see an escalation of tactics in response. I mean, the objective disruptions from climate change are going to increase, but our political system, as it currently is configured, is incapable of responding. So this
Yeah.
pressure is going to keep building. What does that mean? What does it mean in relation to, as Liz said, what does the escalation look like? What are the different, what's the wide range of traditions and disciplines there? My character, Rae, would say, oh, it's the Bonhoeffer moment in the fight to save the Earth, which is an extreme statement justifying her taking a violent action.
Could you say more about that?
Yeah. Rae Kelliher is the life of the party. She's a lively character. She's the person who remembers your birthday. She's the person who wears a silly wig. She's a joyful, and that's part of what makes her able to be a lifelong activist too. She has a sense of humor, but she's a super. She's drops out of college, but she's a prolific reader. Curious. Somebody called her an autodidactic. She's constantly learning things. So one of the things she learns is she reads the life of this German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a pacifist his life and professed, reverence for life and nonviolence, but then participates in a failed plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler and is eventually executed on that. And there's a lot of little literary things, like the day that Rae takes her bold action is the same day that Bonhoeffer, the anniversary of his execution. But anyway, but I didn't want just simply to have that be the only story. And in fact, Rae is exposed to a lot of, and participates in lots of other forms of action. So, in this moment, I think we need, and this is why I'm excited Liz is part of this conversation, we need to talk about, well, what are the things, what are the pressure points, what does it look like to escalate tactics in this moment? And can a fictional literary approach sort of help spark some of that?
Yeah, exactly. Liz, I wanted to ask about if and how art has played a role in your life. Now, I think we're all aware of the power that art has, the way that art has inspired social movements for a long time. For example, you can't think about sort of the folk music revival of the 60s without thinking about how that sort of accompanied really important and massive social movements that came to the fore in the 60s as well. There's so many examples of art and sort of social activism interacting in all kinds of generative ways. What role has, and the novelist in me wants to ask about the role that fiction specifically has played, but I'll broaden that question and ask about the role that art has played in your life, in your trajectory as an activist.
For me, honestly, before the globalization movement, I didn't really understand how it connected. And it was some dear friends of mine, Nadine Block, David Solnit, and others that showed me the power of having just a different lens of art and activism inside of mass disruption that really changes the dynamic about a mass disruption to the point where, well, it's not a talent of mine to create the art. I do think it is a critical piece, and that often in the art creation, it also helps newer activists connect to things because they feel like they're really producing something. I think that we wouldn't have, in most movements, that if we don't have that element, it's not really a movement and it's not long-term and sustainable.
Yeah.
And it doesn't then create the race of the world, because if there's devoid of joy and there's no music and there's no art where people are expressing both their anger about the situation as well as their hope for collective power to win, it's hard to sustain a movement long term if there isn't deeply rooted cultural aspects like art and music embedded into it.
Yeah.
I wonder if we could ask you that question.
Yeah.
I mean,
Sure. This is related to the next question I was going to ask, because this is something I've grappled with personally, and I've had a number of conversations with fellow writers and artists about this, about the social function of art. What is the social function of art? And perhaps more important than that, what is our role? What are we meant to do as artists during this incredibly important time? This is a conversation that artists have been having for quite some time. For example, whether an artist's responsibility is just to kind of introduce beauty into the world, or whether an artist has a responsibility to speak specifically to the challenges that everyday people are facing. My approach has been to try to write from my life in a way, and to write from work that relates to the lives of people that I care about deeply, and hope that in writing about that and paying attention to craft, paying attention to their stories, really surfacing things that perhaps might not come up during the course of a normal conversation, which is to say, sort of exposing, if you will, their humanity to the world, that people will get a deeper sense and understanding of these people and perhaps understand their points of view in ways they did not before. Part of the reason that I think art is so important is because it does provide a window to different perspectives and points of view. But that said, it's still something I grapple with, as I'm currently I've written a draft of my novel. I'm deep in revision mode right now. And something that I'm still thinking a lot about is, what is my responsibility, especially as somebody who during the day thinks about certain things, sort of policy and activism and the rest, and at night is thinking about sentence structure. What is my responsibility? And I think I've come down to the idea that it's individual. I won't malign somebody as an artist, a poet, who says, I'm just interested in creating beauty. I think that's important. I think I join many in sort of rolling my eyes at certain kinds of political poetry that isn't really compelling and is just kind of yelling slogans. I don't think that's effective or helps anyone. But that said, there are some people who are really adept at, creating poetry that speaks in all kinds of incisive and important ways to our world and everything we're experiencing now. So let me throw that question to both of you about the social function of art. Do you have a perspective on that? I'll start with you, Chuck, about responsibility that artists have, especially considering this summer we're seeing temperatures that we've never seen before. I had a really intense conversation with my 6-year-old 2 days ago. I made the mistake of trying to put something recyclable inside the trash, and she looked up at me and said, "No, no, that goes in the recycling bin." So I think even the pressure that people who are young feel, they have this awareness
Yeah.
that there's a crisis, and I don't think any young person should be burdened with that, but they feel it nonetheless. And that also sort of triggers in me all kinds of thoughts about the kind of work I ought to be doing right now. What do you think about the social function of artists as a fellow artist, Jeff?
I think it is really important to carve out space for imagination.
Yeah.
And that's part of the, what I see the role artists that do, that create an autonomous space for people to gather and think critically and think outside the linear box. So that's one thing. I do think generally celebration, carnival, music, all those are what makes us human, and what, Liz said it well, you can't really have a movement that doesn't have that connective tissue of celebration, reverence, humor, joy, carnival. That's how we, I don't really think of myself, I don't think of myself very much as an artist. So I'm kind of like a campaigner who's trying to learn some new tools, including storytelling. I think we all talk about narrative shift and storytelling, but it's absolutely true. Our brains on story are really different than our brains on reports. So yeah, that I think I want to learn more from people like yourself who are great storytellers and want to incorporate that into all the forms of work that I do.
Yeah.
I want to riff on something both of you said about storytelling. Climate change, especially when we first started talking about it, seemed so esoteric.
Yeah.
But the reality is, since the beginning of the extractive economy, there's been consequences for communities, for real people, largely Black, Brown, and Indigenous, who are sacrificed on a regular basis. And one of the key things about getting people to understand climate change is having it have real stories involved in it, because otherwise it was parts per million on a piece of paper that people are like, that just sounds out there. But hearing the frontline leaders talk about the direct impact that the fossil fuel infrastructure build-out has had on their communities, on their families, the increase in cancer, devastation really, which goes to Rae's point of, are there actual climate criminals? And the answer is yes. They've made these decisions knowing that. But part of the storytelling aspect is, how would you connect to climate without stories about the real world impacts it's having, fiction or nonfiction? People need to understand it, and parts per million, people can't wrap their head around that, but they can when they hear someone who's fighting Line 3 talk about what's going to happen in their community, or the folks in Appalachia who are fighting the Mountain Valley Pipeline talk about that as well. So that storytelling is so critical on addressing the fossil fuels and the role they played in our economy, and addressing climate change.
Yeah, and the role of the imagination is also incredibly important. I mean, a German magazine reached out to me last year and asked me to write a piece that imagines how humanity is existing post some major sort of crisis. They kind of left it blank, and it was, so kind of asking for a dystopia, I suppose, in a way, and how humanity survives. I spent a lot of time grappling with that prompt, and eventually it occurred to me as I was writing my piece that the other kind of imagining is important as well, like imagining a future where we're doing well and flourishing. And it becomes harder to kind of imagine that, partly because of the headlines that are constantly kind of buffeting us. And there's a sense, a kind of palpable sense, that things are going in the wrong direction. And I've become more attuned to that because of the way my kids are responding to the news, which we try to keep off when they're around, but they hear it anyway. They know what's going on in the world. There's a sense that we need to confront what's going on. But I think that the other side of it too is important, like imagining a great future where, which is one reason why in addition to writing, I am an ardent sort of believer in Star Trek. I don't usually admit that, but I love that. Great fan of
Speak.
Star Trek. Exactly. Liz, act as if Chuck isn't here for a moment, and there's a number of great sort of movements that are depicted in his book. I was wondering, as somebody who's actually participated in some of those movements, how you feel about how he depicted those.
It was actually really fun to read
Yeah.
that because there are a lot of things that I was a part of or adjacent to or know the people who pulled it together or organized it. And often I have found that when there are things that that try and show a movement, they try and imply there's one person. It's the worst thing that we do when we rewrite history. We make it sound like Martin Luther King Jr. like single-handedly ran the civil rights movement as opposed to the organizing, the community organizers, and that or inspired a direct action and thousands of people just showed up. I think the depiction in the book is really helpful because it shows there's all these different elements, and we do ourselves a grand disservice when we try and frame out people as the leader, because all of our movements are leaderful, and they do not have a leader, and this idea that there is some savior or champion or the Neo from the Matrix, like that's not true.
He's not coming?
No. And if we want to inspire people to realize that they need to see themselves in a movement, they need to understand that we need everyone and everyone's skills in order to win. And I thought you did a really good job weaving times that Rae was a participant in a CD, an organizer on an issue, a cook. Like, I think that's really important because we don't show that often.
Yeah. Chuck, was that could you talk a little bit about creating the story? Did you have like a storyline in mind and you kind of stuck to it, or did you do what I do, which is like you sit and you face the blank screen and you just kind of throw stuff until it sticks? Like, what was your approach there?
Well, I'm still grappling with my identity as a novelist, so I would say I had a story.
Yeah.
I had a character who was one of these lifelong activists I had heard, I have a number of women who are a little bit older than me, kind of my respected elders and movement elders, and a couple of them have said, kind of in an offhanded way, if I were terminally ill, I would consider this. And part of me was like, what would it be like to kind of play that out, the implications of that witness or choice? Because these are people I respected who, like my Rae Kelliher character, were lifelong, nonviolent, principled, moral, nonviolent activists. So I think, once I sort of had that frame, that kind of, that powerful juxtaposition, I wanted to write about formation. How does somebody become who they are? What were the movements that formed her? And really starting at age 19, although I like to think that in the book, Rae has a relationship with her older brother who she reveres, but then they have this falling apart that reflects a lot of families today. There's a polarization, but he's really the one who introduces her to defending the earth, because they have this special place, this special woods and pond that when he sees it threatened with development, he stands up and defends it. He creates essentially a eco-sabotage. He starts pulling up the stakes where the road is going to be built and cutting the ribbons where the trees are going to be cut. And so Rae at age 8 or 9 is taking in her big brother. So to me, that was the fun of it, was thinking about formation, not just the traditional formation story of one mentor, but movements as formation. So once I sort of had that, I kind of had not that hard a time kind of getting a first draft, getting the proverbial shitty first draft done.
Sure.
That kind of helped rough out the story.
Yeah.
Well, I did have a bunch of readers who helped early on, including saying things like, remember, this isn't a nonfiction book,
Yeah.
you know,
What do
like,
they mean by that?
meaning that I was being a little too tell and not enough show. I was more information than
Yeah.
an ordinary fiction book should have about some of these movements. So, you know, I can think maybe 1% of the population might like some of those details, but
Sure.
I left out a little.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
There's a really powerful moment that you just talked about. So a lot of people don't know that I dropped out of college, and it was a conscious decision. And I don't talk about it that often because I often work with a number of youth, and I think it's a very personal decision, and I don't think anyone should ever be recruited to do that profound of a shift in your life. But it's the first time I've actually read what I went through to make that decision of I don't belong here anymore, I belong organizing. And having those pivotal moments has helped me be grounded on the, is this a lifelong thing? Because I walked away from getting a degree to organize because I believed I needed to do that and I couldn't wait, and that I was gaining nothing from being in a classroom anymore. And that was a pivotal moment in my life that I've never looked back. Everyone always assumes I have a degree. I don't. And there's a lot more people who have been stepping into movements who don't come out of college education, and it's really important that we are supporting everyone. This should not be there was a time period where it felt like everyone who had a job in many movements had come out of an elite university and had multiple degrees. And it would become this whisper campaign where I'd get these calls from students who did want to leave school and say, I heard you dropped out. Why? And then I would have a real conversation about it. But it was really nice to actually see that moment of race.
I'm so glad you shared that, because I was at an event last night where somebody they literally asked the question, what would have happened if Rae had finished college and she hadn't dropped out? And I said, well, you just have to think about 1973, that moment, but it was also that, like you described, this calling, this impatience with the theoretical. And, you know, I'm not also trying not to discourage people if they're called to go. But for Rae, it was even high stakes because she was first generation. Her parents hadn't gone to college. She was going to be the first person to go to college. So it was even it was a risky proposition coming from the community that she did. But I also love to celebrate somebody who's so clearly an intellectual, a thinker, who did not get the formal schooling that credentials people. And she lived her whole life, what you described, people making assumptions about her education.
Yeah, important to kind of decouple intelligence from university degrees, right? It's an incredibly important thing to do that we have to do a better job, I think, across our progressive movements of doing. So I'm wondering, as I read this book, it occurred to me that there's a sense of urgency throughout, and that's kind of what we're talking about now, the urgency that inspires you to kind of not finish college and to say there's something that's important. Rae, throughout her life, there was this intense sense of urgency. I wonder where you are on the urgency meter as we, again, sort of confront all kinds of things. Are you thinking actively about ramping up your engagement, your activism? And if so, what does that mean for you?
Well, so on the urgency factor, as somebody who's worked on climate for a while, it's quite frankly terrifying that we're hitting what we thought we would hit in 2050 right now, right? Like to say that it's a future crisis is absurd. It's here and now. There's communities, there's actively people dying all over the place. There's climate migration happening. People are being displaced. If you don't feel urgency in this moment, it's hard to understand what you're looking at, because of, you know, the irony of the floods, and that's the place that the book's set, happening as a climate catastrophe. So what it looks like for me is that it has been that I do believe, like Ray, that the fight is about fossil fuels, and a lot of my work has been supporting the fossil fuel resistance community and trying to figure out what does escalation look like, how do we actually push back, how do we make sure there's no new fossil fuel infrastructure, because it's not true that we can just put solar panels up to get out of this. We actually have to change the reliance on fossil fuels. But to do that, we also have to completely change our economy. There's no way you're going to do that without decoupling it. So it does feel like escalation has to involve more people, and that we have to move the organizations who've been afraid of escalation into understanding that that is one of our top tools, and that we need to be pushing as hard as we can right now. That there's no, but it's not politically possible, we need to wait 10 years. No, like that's not, the science is not there. So for me, it's about how do we get as many people into strategic escalation to have the impact that we need on the national level, but also to stop these individual projects, to stop the Mountain Valley Pipeline, to stop Willow, to help the folks in St. James Parish who are fighting for MOSA continue that fight.
Yeah. I think we have time for, should we go to audience questions or a couple more? Perfect. All right. That's great. Chuck, where are you with respect to like urgency, especially like your decision? You write, you know, series of resonant and important works of nonfiction, and now you've pivoted. I predict it's not the only work of fiction you'll write. We'll see. But you decided it's time to write a novel. How does that fit in with your sense of urgency about the moment and maybe your desire to reach people?
It really grew out of urgency.
Yeah.
In fact, I think, I had a editor who said, now, you know, you could spend a few more months doing some character development here, and you know, I got some really good advice that I ignored because I was a man in a hurry.
Yeah.
I was just like, I kind of want this to come out because I want to be out there talking about this. I want to talk about what Liz just talked about, is the centrality of the fossil fuel industry, all the distraction, even around not just denial, but just we're all responsible for climate change. We all just need to, you know, and we need to do these fixes over here, and yet here's this industry that's, you know, hell-bent on taking us off the cliff. That is their model. So that was the other thing, was like, why just 7 years in the future? Well, 7 years is about the right time frame to start to, we need to sort of start to see the trajectory. So yeah, I mean, on the one hand, I felt that urgency. On the other hand, the other part of the story is, what is it that people can do in place? And I see all around me, and I see this in pockets, urban and rural areas, people practicing mutual aid, coming together, thinking about, you know, land back and access to land and reparations, and how do you welcome strangers to your community who are climate refugees or political refugees or whatever's causing the disruption. People are going to have to move from their communities.
Yeah.
Some of us are going to have to move, and some of us are going to have to welcome new folks to, you know.
Yeah.
So all those are, you know, places where we have some agency in the communities where we live to help create a different culture. All the the local food system, local economy, new attitudes about death and dying, and how we face the end times, the end years of our lives. Anyway, so all of that, I feel the urgency, but I also feel like we need to be grounded in place and community and mutual aid and relationships. So I wanted to not just have, in the end, Rae makes an isolated action, but her whole life is really one of being in community and communities of resistance and action. So I kind of wanted to depict that, because I do think that is a piece of how we're going to face the next 10 years and beyond.
Do you want us, is Rae a model for us, Chuck, or somebody that we should draw inspiration from? How does she function?
Well, maybe taking out the last hour of her life, which I wouldn't necessarily lift up as a model.
Yeah.
And in fact, George Lakey, who I admire a great deal, wrote a great review. He said, yeah, Rae was strategically flawed,
Yeah.
which is a good way of saying whatever. But I think she is a model in her joy of life, of how she insists on bringing people together. She is like a weaver of movements.
Yeah.
She's not a leader. She would never think,
Mhm.
but she's certainly a weaver. She does a lot of the work to support people. And she, as Liz said, she's thinking in a generative way about the next generation. Now she has this adopted sort of daughter character, Alex, who is suffers the sins of the parents.
Yeah.
She has to go to jail for a very minor role in Rae's action.
Yeah.
So part of me was interested in Rae as a flawed person too, you know,
Yeah.
not, you know, but acting on, you know, wrestling. Rae is wrestling in a real way with the moment we're living in.
Yeah. Exactly.
And I wanted to show what it looks like, the interior life of someone wrestling in that way.
Yeah. I'm trying my best to avoid spoilers, but yeah, that's a good point. The last part of that book. Liz, is there anything about this moment that's exciting for you? Anything in terms of the way that people are beginning to get together or recognize the moment, or even something you've encountered in your work that gives you hope?
I mean, a lot of what gives me hope is the level of resistance that we're seeing from a number of communities. You know, the folks on the ground, the frontline communities, the grassroots communities, they've had enough. They've been asked literally to be sacrifice zones, and seeing communities saying, one of the frontline leaders that I worked with like 6 months ago was like, we're going to sue city council for agreeing to have a fossil fuel project here. We're going to sue them individually. And I was like, yes, Sharon. Like, it was very bold. And I'm always amazed when I'm working with the communities who are on the front lines, how they've been devastated. So of course they're going, what is it that we need to do right now? Don't tell me it's not politically possible, because then we need to make it politically possible. And they're coming up with the most innovative and generative ideas about how to push the envelope. And they could care less about the politics, because the politics are asking them literally to be a sacrifice zone. And it's almost always in Black, brown, and indigenous communities. They're not putting pipelines in the Hamptons. They're putting them in St. James Parish. They're putting them in Port Arthur. So that's what really inspires me, is getting a chance to help support those communities in the fights that they're doing, and just the creative ideas that are coming from the front lines.
Yeah. Final question before throwing it to the audience. Chuck, you have the advantage of having a great title for this book, Altar to an Erupting Sun. It's just a very, it's a kind of title that sort of inspires all kinds of imagery in your mind, and also altars kind of recurs as a motif in the book. Could you talk a little bit about that decision?
Yeah,
Title
thanks.
and-
Yeah, I mean, in a way, the book for me is an altar. It's and there are some real living people who are, some of still alive, that gave me permission to be in the book. So my hope is people read it and like looking at an altar and saying, I want to learn more about the life of this person and the stories. And you know, Rae Kelliher as a character is an altar builder. She builds private altars to grieve. She builds public altars. She's shaped by Vietnamese and Latin American and even the Irish Samhain altar tradition. So, and a couple people have read the book. I'm actually thrilled. I've been getting emails every day from people who are reading the book, and one person said, I'm going to start an altar practice. And I actually think that's a good thing, because I think we need, you know, part of what Rae is saying is, if you can't tap into your ancestors, if you can't tap into the elders that have come before you as a source of strength, you're going to struggle. We need to call on all the powers that are there. So there's a spiritual, irreverent element to her worldview that. And she would say our attitudes about death. If we're death phobic, if we can't think about our own end of life, we're not going to be able to face the next 10 years either. Yeah. I lived in Oaxaca, Mexico, and for a couple years, and so I got to experience like the celebration of Day of the Dead, which is how people talk about it. And when you spend the night in the cemetery and you're sort of honoring somebody's mother or father or sister or brother, you realize their fear and attitudes about death are really different because you're not alone, and as long as you're remembered, you still exist in the memories of the people who love you and honor you and put you on their altar. So that was part of one of the fictional threads is the power of altar building, the book as an altar, and the erupting sun is we're living with the erupting sun. So both, yeah.
Indeed. Thanks to both of you for this great conversation so far. I'm wondering if any of you have questions or comments or, yeah.
I'm willing to offer my mobile mic if you need it.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Hello. Okay, now you can hear me.
Thank you, Lori.
First things first, I'd just like to thank you for this. I'd just like to thank you for this talk. It's been incredible hearing all of your thoughts and getting to like experience the different considerations that came into writing this book. I think first I'd also like to say you're definitely an artist. I remember that part earlier where you said it's weird calling yourself an artist. I know that feeling exactly, because when you say the word artist, it conjures a very specific image, and I think most people don't think of writers as readily as they would think of like somebody who's a musician or a painter or something, but writing is one of the oldest art forms, so you're still carrying in a very long and old tradition. And I guess my question would be, the jump between primarily writing nonfiction and doing a lot of policy work. You kind of tailor your audience very specifically with the things that you write, whether they be for an audience that's like politicians or organizers or students or something like that. But fiction typically draws like a very different audience, and I'm wondering if when you were thinking of this book and started writing it, you had a vision in mind of the person that you wanted to read it. And if so, like, how did that person you had in mind influence how you wrote the book?
Yeah, actually, I have a couple audiences in mind. One is, as a parent, I have 3 children in their 20s, and they were readers and gave me input into the story. There's one particular audience I was thinking about, which is people over 60. And there's a whole movement that Bill McKibben and Akaya Winwood have started. They call it the third act, which reminds me of the Mexican notion of tercera edad, the last third of your life. There is no fourth act, as far as so your third act, and the third actors are people who are saying, "Look, I'm approaching retirement, maybe, or I'm at the end of my life. I have life experience. Why are we expecting young people, the Sunrise Movement? Why are we assuming that they're going to take the risk to lead these movements, these disruptive movements, and be engaged?" So I was thinking about my cohort, as somebody who's over 60 now, and engage, both honoring that, and a lot of this was written. A lot of people that are in sort of activist circles will see part of themselves in this story because they lived it. So part of it was to honor those folks. And by the way, that's a really good demographic for book sales. People who are women over 60 are the main purchasers of books. They have book clubs. They talk about books. They are engaged.
You're right on the money.
Exactly. So
My
anyway.
mom bought your book and lives in a retirement home and was saying maybe I'll bring it to book club. She's halfway
They're going to
through.
book club it.
So yeah, so I would joke that there's the third act, and then there's Ray's group, which is called Last Act. No, but you know but I actually really wanted. There's a lot of younger people reading it saying, I want to know this history. I want to know about most social movements that came before, and so clearly that part is very much an important part of it. So yeah, that was very much a part of the story, was celebrating people who might see themselves and opening a window into movements that came before that shaped where we are. Yeah, great question. Thank you. I should also say, I love being at IPS with people who write fiction. I hope Sarah Anderson will keep working on her novel, so that the next year maybe we'll all be gathered as she talks about her kind of historic / Civil War / contemporary novel. So it's an invitation and encouragement to pick up the pen or whatever.
Thanks. Beautiful conversation among you, and thank you for writing the book. I've had the pleasure of reading it, so I want to recommend it to everyone. I'm curious, it's clear to me that I think both you, Liz, and Chuck aren't in favor of blowing up CEOs of fossil fuel companies. So my question is, what do you want to do with them if you don't want to blow them up? And I'm curious because, Liz, you talked about the movements you're most excited about, and they're local. So they're people taking on the projects of fossil fuel companies and stopping them. But what do you think are the creative things that need to be done on the companies themselves and, I guess, their CEOs?
Before we discuss anything with violence potentially, please remember that the FBI is listening through your phones most likely, and they all just tuned in.
So I had a long history of doing corporate campaigning, and I including working on pressuring the banks for funding fossil fuels. I do think that we can't think of them as corporations. There's individuals making decisions to literally make the planet uninhabitable. And the idea that they are not being held accountable, they should be treated like war criminals. Like, can you imagine the amount of people that have already died over climate change? What we would be doing if a single person had made a decision or a regime had made that decision? We are still trying people out of Germany. Why are we not holding them personally accountable? They 100% knew a long time ago what they were doing. They understood the science. They made the decision anyways because they figure they can get as much money and it won't affect them. So I think that we do have to have some personal accountability. Like, long term, I think that we should put them on trial.
Yeah. There's a, at the 7 years later, at the end of the book, Ray's sort of adopted or sort of semi-daughter says, what Rae did was wrong, but what Rae would say is, what bold action are you willing to take to defend Mother Earth? And what does bold look like for each of us? And then the other thing is this, as just Liz says, the laser focus on responsible individuals. And one of the things I've really enjoyed about getting out and talking about this book is people show up with the sort of like, well, aren't we all responsible for climate change? Aren't we all addicted to oil? I feel bad because I, drove my car to the store. I could have walked or ridden my bike. My carbon footprint is high. I take airplanes. Like, you hear the personal responsibility narrative around climate change is pretty strong. And Rae, as a character, comes out of this tradition where she works in Central America. She sort of has a global picture, the history of colonialism, and yeah, she would say, yeah, you're right. People in the United States, the middle class, affluent classes, people who are particularly white, who've benefited from almost, a century of burning fossil fuels, we're all responsible. We're all responsible. But as Rae gets into the last sort of 5 years of her life, she's really looking at, well, when did Shell and ExxonMobil know this? How did they wield their power? How did they use their power to fund denial, fund delay, block alternatives right up to the moment we're sitting in here, have their way with, and capture our political system? And, you realize, like, people have their little carbon footprint indicator, surveys. BP is promoting. They want us all to be thinking about our individual carbon footprint. So part of the power of Rae's witness is saying there are a couple of dozen leaders of these corporations who have a lot of culpability and a lot of responsibility. And she wants you to know their names, and she wants those people to live in fear of the consequences of their actions. That's a really different kind of discussion. That's not the discussion that enough of us, I think, are having. And then what does it look like to say, well, their behavior should be criminalized. There should be global and national tribunals looking at the role of certain individuals and companies in blocking alternatives and running out the clock. And so in terms of, war criminal or, narco trafficker, think about leaders of enterprises that have lost their social cachet. They should be put on trial. They will be put on trial. It may not be soon enough, but, we will be looking back at these actors and the role that they played in limiting our options. So that's one of the powerful points. And then I think, if once we sort of understand, then it's like, well, maybe we should create public authorities to seize or purchase or take the assets of these fossil fuel companies and wind them down, I would hope, as in the book, the fictional future, that 7 years from now, the fossil fuel industry is in a very different place, regarded very differently than they are today, regarded really as criminal, as Rae would say, they are the incarnation of evil. And she doesn't use that word lightly. She doesn't use that word about anything else, anyone else. But this is what evil looks like.
And we have time for one last question.
Thank you. This has been a great discussion about the role of the artist and social change. When Liz mentioned earlier, she made the comment that Neo from The Matrix isn't coming to save us. And it made me think about the cultural space, the reverence we give to a genre of our culture, superheroes, comic books, right? It's hard to see a movie in the theater that isn't somehow related to one of these comic book universes. And I used to think that was just, harmless daydreaming or whatever, but we also now live in a world where people think they really can change the world through a mass shooting, or they can overthrow the government, so how do you think about that in terms of social change and the cultural place we give to this kind of thinking, superpower, ex machina kind of solutions?
I think that there's been a little bit of a reckoning in some movement spaces. The biggest challenge in the nonprofit space is it's historically steeped in white supremacy. It's led by white men, and they've been treated like they are the leaders, and they are going to solve it all. And I think that there has been more in the last 5 to 10 years of that's not what this looks like. That's not going to solve this. Having a set of people who have a star-like status versus what does it look like to have movement infrastructure that's about empowering as many people as possible. We don't need everybody. There's the famous studies that we need about 3.5% of the people to actually create social change, we need to have movement infrastructure that's about empowering as many people so that they don't go, wow, that person's amazing, versus how can I participate? And I think the superhero thing makes people feel like it's unattainable and there's no role for them, versus what we need is, how do we have the space that folks see themselves in movements and see themselves in the fight and don't think that there's someone else that's going to do it. And it's a lot of continued reckoning on the reinforcing of our existing culture showed up in movement spaces, and we can't win that way. We need people, and we need the infrastructure to be centered around the movement and not individual folks.
You know, I think one of the things that I try to depict in the story is the community that comes together around resistance. You know, so there's this effort to stop a pipeline in West Roxbury, a neighborhood of Boston. There are no kind of single leaders. And this is in fact, we have a mutual friend, Marla Markham, who's a great campaigner, and she said that was where she got to put into practice the sort of building a community, a web of people. In fact, we just had a reunion 7-8 years later, and 50 people came out to a potluck, and everybody talked about the impact of that year and a half that we spent together working to try to resist this pipeline, and how formative it was for people and the relationships. So yeah, I think celebrating the webs and communities and mutual aid we create together around these struggles, because that's really going to be how we sustain ourselves. And it's not going to be lone rangers, and it's not going to be single acts. And that's a flaw. That's a strategic flaw in Rae's final act, is she acted alone. She was also, you can kind of empathize with her sense of powerlessness at the end of her life as well. But she lived her life trying to be that weaver and web of people. And that's more of what we need, not the Marvel comic hero, great man theory of history.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end. I'd love to thank you, Liz, so much for this conversation. Chuck as well. Busboys and Poets, so grateful to you for hosting us. The Wallace Global Fund for helping to fund this conversation. I should also mention that this is the second in a series of conversations we're having with Wallace Global Fund with folks who've written books and activists as well. We're cooking up the next one. We'll let you know as soon as we know what that's going to be. But thank you so much for coming out. It's been a pleasure having this conversation with all of you. Thanks.
And if I could just echo thanks to Liz for reading the book on vacation and participating in this discussion, and Tope, our novelist in chief. And as an author, I invite you to think of someone you could gift the book to that maybe wasn't here, that you could. I loved signing books to younger or older friends and allies. Thank you, Busboys and Poets, for being this curator of this amazing space. Thanks to the people who joined on the Zoom or on the YouTube or whatever. And I hope you'll talk up the story and tell people about it. It's reaching people in word of mouth, and it's leading to more of these kind of discussions about what it is that we can do together. So that's the only hope, the real hope I have.
I wanted to thank you both for including me in this. It's, as an organizer and campaigner, we're normally talking about our issues or recent strategy, and it's a real privilege to be able to have a deeper conversation on, centered around a book, but really on the why, how, long term, what do we think needs. So I just completely appreciate it. And the book is really amazing. I wasn't expecting a fiction book from you. So it's very powerful and very provocative. And I was glad to have a reason to take some time to read a fiction book. A lot of activists, we struggle with that. So I really appreciate both of you for pulling me in.
Buy the book. It's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you again to our lovely special guests. And you can purchase the book here at Busboys and Poets 14th and B, or you can go onto bookshop.org and purchase a copy and support your local independent bookstore. Support local, not Amazon. Anyhow, thanks, folks. We'll hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.